Welcome, bonjour à tous, konbanwa. So let me introduce myself. I'm Frédéric Julian, ethologist, archaeologist, and anthropologist at the EHESS in France. And I'm a co-pilot with Professor Abbé and Professor Niles of this online symposium open to everybody. You are welcome to this second day on the arts of living with nature organized by RIHN. The RIHN, the Research Institute of Humanity in Nature, was established 20 years ago in Kyoto as an academic institution to study environmental issues through a cultural approach. As an inter-university research institute, it aims to build a global environmental studies that contribute to solving environmental problems by selecting projects with clear objectives for a limited period of time under free programs based on long-term perspective through public solicitation. So we are in the right place for this second day entitled Earthly Intelligence, the Planetary Vernacular. It's follow-up to the UNESCO meeting we organized in Paris at UNESCO 3 years ago on the subject of the different form of thinkings among beings, those nature think, and which had allowed to explore a non-dualistic approaches to nature. Here we continue in the same vein and receive tonight two eminent colleagues, Augustin BERQUE and Tim INGOLD, who will present their respective vision and dialogue between them. We will then open the debate with the people, with the connected people whom I invite to ask their question in writing in a small question response box at the bottom of their screen. On behalf of the Research Institute and the EHESS, I would like to thank our guests for agreeing to speak here, but also on my own behalf, because I'm very happy to see their vision of the world and of intellectual exploration brought together tonight. Tim INGOLD has been with me since the mid-80s, and my first field work on chimpanzee and first hominids, which I sometimes approached through his critical filter and with his methods, which we were always ahead of current work in anthropology. Not hesitating to approach human societies from the point of view of their ecology, biology, archaeology. In fact, INGOLD used a multi-dimensional way, in other words, in all their evolutionary and comparative complexity. Tim INGOLD has always confronted the dominant reductionism, sociobiology, or culturalist ones. By advocating a complex approach to the mechanism of thought, behavior, and gesture, INGOLD leads us to another anthropology of which I can hardly see an equivalent, except perhaps in the mesological enterprise advocated by Augustin BERQUE. My encounter with Augustin is more recent and linked to Japan, first with his main book on nature in Japan, but also on his critiques of dualism and of the modernity and mechanicist approach. And of course, because he's one of the main promoter of Imanishi thinking for French people. And Imanishi is central in our dialogue. So to both of you tonight. I will ask a bunch of questions, how to rethink non-human, how to get out of fixist ontologies. What is an animal? What are the main link we can draw with non-human? And all those questions should be raised later, but now I will start the debate with you, Augustin, and ask Tim to comment, and after we will come to public questions. So thanks of you per advance. Augustin, the floor is to you.
Merci.
Thank you very much. I have written my paper in English, therefore I would like to make my presentation in Japanese today. The title, Cosmophany, the living art of opening ambient worlds. How shall we understand this? Let me explain. Cosmos means the world, but at the same time it means order, order. And also, funny means to express, to come to expression, to one's existence. How does the world exist? Does the reality exist? This is the basic question. So, here we are including humans, and we would like to consider all living things or all living matters. The European language, Indo-European language, is the origin, including English, French, and German. The root of the word art in the Indo-European world is AR or R. R is the origin of the word art. And what does R mean? It has two meanings. R has two meanings. One is to come to, one is to mean joint, and the other is to the meaning of arrangement. In English, art means art, but in German, the word art has a different basic meaning. Art, Weise, this expression means to think as. So it is equivalent to the way in Japanese, or who in Japanese, the way to do something, for example. And based upon the natural environment, how are you going to understand it? You understand it as something, and the world is developed in that way. How are we going to think? In which way are we going to think about it? Is the theme of my paper. So the world is basically the earth. So based upon the earth, we meaning all living matters, including human and animals and all living matters. How does our world develop on the earth? In Japanese, there is a word fudo. I would like to analyze fudo in a grammatical way. Fu is a determinative. Fu is a determinative, and do is a determined word. Fudo, do, can be considered in a way, and it becomes fudo, and it becomes a reality. So in Japanese, fudo is limited to human beings. But if we apply it to all living matters, it will be envelope or milieu. Milieu in French and envelope in German. The word milieu exists in English, but milieu in French and milieu in English are different. So in terms of fudo, milieu as fudo, in English is very difficult to express. So I am using the word French, milieu in French, in order to express fudo. And I think in English too, I think you can appreciate the word milieu to some extent. So fudo in Japanese, as I have said, do can be captured in a way, and it is one process. It is a movement. It is dynamic. As a starting point, you have a starting point, and you head towards something. As you know, Watsuji, Tetsuro's a famous book entitled Fudo. In the first line of the book, the Fudo-sei concept is introduced. Watsuji says that it is a structural moment of a human existence. That is what he says Fudo is in his first line of his book. In animals in general, or in any living matters in general, it will be an unveiled. And so unveiled is unveiled a structural moment, is what it means. Of course, the center theme of the symposium is art. So, how can what I have explained is related to art is what I would like to talk about from now. Heidegger's famous paper entitled The Origin of the Work of Art. I would like to focus on this paper. As you know, what is expressed in this paper is about the Earth, or the Welt in German. It's not actually Earth according to Heidegger, but it is Earth according to myself. So Gielde, or the land, the grand land, and Die Welt, the world. And in between the two, there is a dispute or conflict or a fight. What is that? What is the fight? When reading the origin of the work of art, it is very difficult to understand what the fight or the dispute is all about. But this is a natural way of Heidegger. He does not clarify things. But 5 years before the origin of the work of art, he has written another paper, or he disclosed this in one of his seminars, and after he passed away, it became a book. And the title of the book is The Basic Concept of Metaphysics. And in this book, he talks about metaphysics. What is the basis of metaphysics is the question he asks. And the basics, he says, is logic. And in this case, in this seminar, he refers to execute, but it is not so clear. So what he develops, the logic that he develops in his class is A becomes B, the process of A to become B. In this process, in German, from something to it becomes something from something. So to become, what is to become? What is the process of to become? What is the logic of to become?
And in Germany, als is the terminology to express it. That is as in English. In Japanese, that is toshite. So als is basically as something, nani nani toshite. So toshite. So how does as work? In the origin of the work of art, he looked into the work of as, and he said, effect of art, according to Heidegger, is poetry, a result of poetry that the world opens. At the same time, the world, what is developed in the world, is based on the earth. Same time in this process, when the world opens, then it goes back to the earth. So it opens up and it returns back to be protected. In the logics, it's very difficult to understand, but as a nutshell, if you look at the fundamental concept of metaphysics, this thinking becomes a little bit more clearer. So it's about subject and predicate. This is the relation between subject and predicate. So what is the relation between subject and predicate in a nutshell? Basically, for subject, predicate says something, and how predicate says something about subject. The way it says something about subject, that is the development of meaning as well as development of existence. Subject is S, and predicate is represented by P. In this process, S becomes P. So in English, that is a predication, process of predication. It's not about predication itself, but it's also at the same time, it returns back to the origin. So what does it mean? So in this paper of Heidegger, the earth is basically S. So the earth is subject or substance. Why? Is because in European philosophy, in the metaphysics sense, the subject is, well, substance is on the base of the logic becomes subject. So in metaphysics, the event is in logics is P, it's a predicate. I understand it's very difficult to follow, but the earth and the world, how they are related. If I go back to that discussion, so living matters, living beings, especially human beings, take environment in a way to develop reality for themselves. So based on environment, they open up reality that the world is a space where all living beings exist. So in this process, well, for Japanese, it's a bit easier to follow. Just sharing one example in Japanese. For example, you say teacher comes, teacher has come. Basic meaning is that basically teacher has come. But in Japanese culture, you don't say teacher has come, but you say sensei has come. But in Aristotle thinking, that is impossible because the substance of teacher cannot be an event because teacher is S. S is S. That's all. But why S can become non-S? So it means why a teacher can become an event. In Japanese language, well, this is an issue which is related to tradition of Japan. It's a relation between being something and become something. So you are a teacher, but you become a teacher. So it's about a tradition of Japanese language. And when it comes to food, though, science of food, it's about trajection, or the process of trajection. So it's in Japanese tsutai, and S becomes P in trajection, then the reality is born out. So that is how I can explain. But of course, I know it's quite difficult to follow, but those who live in Kyoto, maybe that kind of thinking could be easy to follow. But in Kyoto, there is a temple, a famous temple, Myoshinji, and there is a garden. And there are 3 gardens in this temple, and one of which is a garden for Mu. Mu is nothing, and another garden is for you, for use. And then the third garden is called Tai, the body. So from my understanding, this is the process of projection. So Mu, nothingness. Nothing has become being. So that is the garden of Mu. And then the third garden is garden of substance. Now it exists for us as something. So from Mu and Tai, between nothing and substance, there is you, U is basically a traduction. In Oriental sense, which is a process from nothing to substance in Western sense. So if we take an Aristotle view, is maybe this is not nothing, but this is a substance. So that is the difference. That's all. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I think I see some elements, but perhaps we suspect some connection between people, and it never happened. It happened always in a different sense. So I suspect there is a lasso between Team INGOLD and what you have presented. But perhaps I'm wrong. So Tim, the floor is open. And I suspect the lasso is a possible link between both of you. Please.
Okay, thank you very much, Frederic, and thank you very much indeed, Augustin, for such a wonderfully interesting paper. Two main questions arise from it. The first question is how do we describe the world as it is inhabited by living beings? And the second, is there any fundamental ontological difference between this world and the world inhabited by human beings? So those, I think, are the two key questions that you address. And immediately we face a problem of language. And this is not just the problem of what difference language makes to our perception of the world, but even more immediately, the fact that we are using language here to discuss this problem, and that language itself is a multiplicity. So you, the prodigiously versatile Augustin, are working across 4 languages, French, Japanese, German, and English, and each of these offers a rich and varied vocabulary on which we can draw to describe the world we inhabit. English, for example, that is my own mother tongue, offers world, earth, nature, environment, cosmos, milieu, and many more. And even if other languages offer close counterparts, their resonance is never exactly the same. So we are faced with what is often said to be the problem of translation. But I don't think we should take this negatively, as if to say, oh, how much easier it would be if we all spoke the same language. Easier, maybe, but dull and uncritical. The great thing about translation is that it forces us to attend to subtle differences that would otherwise go unnoticed, differences which often turn out to be revelatory. So with that little introduction, let me turn to the first question. How are we to describe the world as it is inhabited by living beings? And to answer this, we have, as Augustin does, to make one obvious distinction. It's a distinction that is so obvious that it is, I think, surprising how much philosophical ink has been spilled on it, and how often it has been reasserted by scholars as if they were making it for the first time. It's simply the distinction between the world as it primordially exists in itself and the world as it exists for any living inhabitant. Now, there are endless ways in which we can signal this distinction, and Augustin has offered several alternatives. We have, for example, environment versus ecumene, biosphere versus semiosphere, or in German, Umbegung versus Umwelt. Now, this last contrast, Umbegung versus Umwelt, comes to us, of course, from the writings of Jacob von Uexküll. Von Uexküll was a pioneer in the study of the perceptual worlds of animals, including humans, and is nowadays acknowledged as the founding father of biosemiotics, whose writings profoundly influenced the philosophy of Martin Heidegger. But other authors offer different pairings of terms, among them James Gibson in his pioneering work on ecological psychology. Now, Gibson distinguishes between, these are his terms, the physical world and the environment. And he says conflating the two, as in the expression, the physical environment, is apt to get us mixed up. And yet notice how in all these distinctions, the seeds of confusion are already present. Because what Gibson calls, for example, environment as opposed to physical world, is equivalent to what BERQUE calls ecumene as opposed to environment. Now, like Augustin, I've also been influenced by both Gibson and von Uexküll, and have been at pains in my own work to distinguish between reality of and reality for. Now, if we take reality of, in a rather colloquial sense, to be nature, and reality for to be environment, then of course it makes no sense to speak, as we so often do, of the natural environment. And of course, too, we can accept that nature exists as a physical reality, independently of its perception by any living being, just as it must already have existed before life ever evolved on this planet. And philosophers will debate interminably about how this physical reality of can be accessed, or whether it can be accessed at all, but that's no reason to doubt its existence. But with reality for, it is quite otherwise, because an environment in this sense can only exist in relation to a living being whose environment it is. Just as there can be no organism without an environment, so there can be no environment without an organism. Okay, so far so good. But then things get a bit more complicated. Let's compare, for example, James Gibson and Jacob von Uexküll. Gibson, as I've noted, distinguished the environment from the physical world. Von Uexküll distinguished the Umwelt from the Umgebung. And yet Gibson's environment and von Uexküll's Umwelt are not at all equivalent. And Gibson himself was at pains to emphasize the point, insisting, and in his book he insisted, that his understanding of environment should not on any account be confused with, and I quote, what some animal psychologists have been calling the phenomenal environment or subjective world of a species. And although he didn't name names, I'm pretty sure he had von Uexküll in mind here. So in Gibson's mind anyway, what he was calling the environment is quite different from Umwelt, even though both he and von Uexküll would have insisted that it's something that exists only in relation to a living being. So what is the difference between environment for Gibson and Umwelt for von Uexküll? Well, for von Uexküll, as Augustin has explained very clearly in his paper, for von Uexküll, the animal throws meaning onto its environment. The word that von Uexküll used was tone, a sort of affective tone or value that is put onto things, aspects of the environment, giving them a meaning for that particular animal. And obviously different animals with different ways of living throw meaning, throw tones differently onto the world as it is. So each species inhabits its own particular bubble of reality. But that means that when an animal dies, or collectively, if a species becomes extinct, then that bubble bursts. It's not there anymore. The Umwelt vanishes totally. The Umbegung is still there, but the Umwelt is gone. Now, this is where Gibson took a quite different view, because Gibson said the environment consists of what he called affordances, and affordances are what the environment offers to an animal in the pursuit of its own particular way of living. So, you know, a tree affords the possibility of climbing for a squirrel, and so on and so forth. A stone affords the possibility of smashing shells for a thrush. But and these, the set of affordances in any environment comprises what he called the environmental niche. However, Gibson insisted that the niche as a set of affordances exists out there. It is part of the real world, whether or not an animal is actually present to utilize it. So Gibson writes, the organism depends on its environment for its life, but the environment does not depend on the organism for its existence. So this is the key difference. With one exclude, you couldn't have an Umwelt without the organism whose Umwelt it is. For Gibson, he said, well, in a sense, you can. But that led Gibson to a contradiction that he was never able to resolve. Gibson always wanted to have it both ways. On the one hand, he wanted to say that the environment for an animal can exist only in relation to that animal itself and what it does and its activities. On the other hand, he wanted to say, no, the environment actually exists as a set of affordances in the real world. It's physically there, whether an animal is there or not. He was never able to resolve that contradiction. And in a moment, I'll show why I think that's the case. And yet, in my own approach, I have tended to prefer Gibson to von Verqueux. And this is because in Gibson's work, it is allied to a theory of direct perception. That is, Gibson insisted, and I agree, that an environment is present to an animal. It doesn't have to be interpreted. It is there, it is present, and the animal responds directly to it. For von Verqueux, on the other hand, the environment is present only through its signs. What you perceive are the signs of things. And the sign always stands for something else which is absent. So there's a peculiar way in the whole semiotic approach in which the world is always escaping from the perceiver. You can only breathe the signs of air, not air itself. You can only eat the signs of food, not food itself. And it seems to me that we cannot inhabit a world of signs, but we do inhabit a world of meanings. And the key thing is, for Gibson, is that he shows how it's possible for animals, including humans, to inhabit meaningful worlds. He shows how there can be meanings without signs. That is to say, meaning does not depend on signification. Nevertheless, there's this curious asymmetry in Gibson's writing, which is that on the one hand, he treats the perceiver, animal or human, as alive and active in the world, moving around, exploring it, finding out what it affords. And yet the world that this perceiver is exploring appears to be static. It's already laid out. It's already there, rather like a stage set. And the actor comes upon the stage set and explores all its affordances, but nothing is happening in the world itself. So it's as though the world is there waiting for you, but you never have to wait for the world. And this for me is the key thing, because it seems to me that the world that we inhabit, we, meaning us or any creatures, the world that creatures inhabit is not simply given, it's not already laid out, but continually under construction. And it's continually under construction by way of the activities of all its inhabitants. This is something that evolutionary biologists have very belatedly come to realize. There's a large literature emerging just in the last few years on what they call niche construction. And according to niche construction theorists, the creatures, living creatures, don't only inhabit an environment and adapt to it, they're also continually making that environment in and through their activities. And what they make is then something that often endures, so that later generations find themselves in an environment that has been very much fashioned by previous generations, and they then have to adapt to it. So that niche construction theorists are talking about this dynamic way in which animals are, in a sense, both constructed and constructed by their environments. The funny thing is that this is typical of evolutionary biology, the most conservative branch of science I've ever come across, that they've only just discovered this. They don't know about von Uexküll, they don't know about Gibson, they've just discovered this for themselves as if for the first time. So this isn't what is we've known for decades, because we've read von Uexküll and we've read Heidegger and we've read Gibson, is news to evolutionary biologists. That's another story. But this is the reason, because I think environments, or whatever we want to call them, ecumeny, are continually in progress, continually under construction, never finished. That's why I actually prefer and like the term milieu. Milieu is, of course, a word that exists in both French and English, slightly different resonances in each language, but literally, of course, milieu means middle place. It's an in-between. And it's because of that in-betweenness that in Augustin's terms, ecology becomes mesology, the study of the in-between. But then the challenge is to say, well, in what sense in between? Now, classical ecology, of course, speaks of the relations between organisms and their environment. Any ecological textbook would tell you ecology is the study of the relations between organisms and their environments. End of story. So in their understanding, that is a classical ecology, you have an organism here, you have an environment here, or perhaps an environment all around, and then they draw an arrow, say, oh, here's a relation between the organism here and the environment there. So it's a back and forth, an interactive relationship between this and that, organism and environment. So in that sense, the between spans the interval between the two. But in the milieu, I think life runs in between, more like the river runs between its banks. The river water is not going from one bank to the other. The river water is flowing along in between the two, not from anywhere to anywhere else. It's just carrying on, generating itself as it goes. So in the milieu, life runs in between, like the river between its banks, not connecting one bank to the other, but simply flowing along. So in that sense, I would regard the milieu as a kind of entanglement of lifelines, a sort of a real tangle in which every line is trying to find a way through all the others. Remember in Darwin's Origin of Species, he has this lovely metaphor of the tangled bank. He imagines a bank covered with a great tangle of vegetation that's been growing quite freely, and every little shoot and root is tangling with every other, trying to find its way through. And I think that's a good way to think about it, to think about what you would call the ecumeny. But that brings me to the other key term of your discussion, along with ecumeny or reality for, and that is trajection. Literally, trajection, I suppose, means throwing a line across. But the question is, what kind of line is it? Is this? Is it a line that goes across, sort of going from one thing to another, or from nothing to something, or from A to B, or is it, that is, does it head towards something? Does it have a destination? Or is it a line like the line of flow of that running river that simply is carrying on, going along? And in my understanding of what Augustin says about trajection, you would think of it as something that is going across. So somewhere in your paper, you talk about how we, humans anyway, seize aspects of the environment, rather as though the astronomer with his telescope is throwing a rope across the cosmos to rein in the stars. It's as though with our technological equipment, we can throw a line to the star and bring it in. And so the line of trajection is that line of radiation, that a ray of light, let us say, that spans the cosmos from the star to the telescope, to our eyes, millions of light years. But then I came to think of what Maurice Merleau-Ponty writes about seeing the stars. It's not that at all. It's not throwing a line across from us to the stars. Rather, when we see, it's because the stars are in our own eyes, and we have expanded to embrace the stars. When Merleau-Ponty speaks about vision, he explains how vision comes about when the space of affectivity or awareness invades and fills the space of the cosmos. So in our experience, the star is not a distant cosmic object, but actually something that twinkles in our own eyes. And the twinkling of the star is something that goes along in real time in our own experience. We have, literally, we have stars in our eyes. So in that case, the line of trajection is not a line that is going across from us to the stars, but it is a line in real time in which we and the stars go along together, live our lives together, in which the stars become us and we become the stars, and we're living along. So the line, the trajection, is not from A to B, it's not destination oriented, it is carrying along like the line of the river flow in the in-between. That then, I think, leads to the question of art and science, such a big question that I really can't, I mean, we need there's not time to address it properly. And I know it's the main point of the paper, but it seems to me to be a question of priority. That is to say, do we say that in our knowledge of the world, science comes first and art is an extra? Or do we say, on the other hand, that actually the very possibility of science is grounded in art? And that's what I would say, and I think it's what Augustin would say, and certainly what Heidegger would say, that art is a recognition of the fact that we can only know the world from the inside of our being in it, that we can only know the world in and through a coupling of our own awareness with those aspects of the cosmos that command our attention. And therefore, all science, all knowledge evolves out of that fundamental poetic involvement of the being in its world, in which our awareness and the cosmos, in a sense, become one, and we go along together. But I just wanted to finish by coming back to language and to the question, that second question I began with, that is whether there is something fundamentally different about human worlds, the human ecumene, as compared with the worlds of other animals. And for me, it's a question of whether we, meaning humans here, whether we humanize the world in the sense of projecting human symbolic schemes, meanings, significations upon a world that is there and ready and waiting for us to do so, or whether rather we form ourselves and the world in the very process of living in it. The first approach is represented above all in the work of André Leroi-Gourhan that Augustin also refers to, about how the thing about humans is they actually humanize the world in a way that no other creature does. The second approach I take actually from the medieval philosopher Raymond Lull, who said that man is a humanifying animal, homificans, that rather than humanizing the world, we humanify. And humanifying means co-creating ourselves and the world continually as we go along. So in that sense, I would like to think of language as a means not of humanizing, but of humanifying, the continuous process of fashioning ourselves and the world of which we are part. And this is not a projection of meaning onto the world, but the discovery of meaning through our participation in it. So in language, every life is lived as a story, so that the entanglement of lives becomes an entanglement of stories or of voices, or in short, of a conversation. So what language doesn't exist as a thing. Language exists only as languaging, only as a conversation of voices. And surely this is what translation really is, not a carrying of meaning across, but the continual discovery of meaning as we go along, as we carry on living together in difference, as we humanify. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much, Tim. It was very, very rich. And I think Augustin has plenty of comments to an answer. And again, of course, you raised a lot of topics, and Gibson was one of the angular stone for your work, and I think could be a link. IDA, I think, a concept developed by and presented by Augustin should be perhaps one of the way to link both of you. So I leave the speech to Augustin now. Thank you very much.
Well, I will. My answers, I cannot answer all the problems you have evoked, but one or two questions. You have mentioned stars and the link with stars, and we could think also of the moon. And you made me remember a word from Imanishi, who said, and he's as a specialist, that monkeys do not look at the moon. 猿は月を見ない。どうでしょうね。本当かどうかは私は、I don't know if it's really like, I'm not a primatologist, so I don't know. But I'm sure Imanishi was right, anyhow. Because in the world of a monkey, in the world of an ape, things exist in their own way, though they are there to be taken as something, but they are taken in their proper way. And in that sense, I am fundamentally Gibsonian, because Gibson says that affordances are always there to be perceived, even if they are not perceived. So I'm sure that's it. The earth is always there, but how do we perceive it? That's the problem. And the central question of mythology, mythology, is how can we make both Galileo's earth, which turns around, and Husserl's earth, which does not move, bewegt sich nicht. That's the problem. I have been thinking about that problem for many years. And the answer I could propose is the trajection, because that is between the two, that which is between the two gardens of the Tokai-an. There is Yu no Niwa. What is going on in between? And you also said that, well, one of the questions you posed is a trajection, well, going to A from A to B, but at the same time, it's supposed that A always is there, even if we perceive A as B, A is always there. So in this sense, I'm Gibsonian. But well, what I had to say, I have already developed. So I think other questions would be welcome.
May I just, Frederic, may I respond to that? I really, the point about looking at the moon is really beautiful. I mean, let us pretend. I also would imagine somehow that I haven't studied monkeys either, but we can probably agree that maybe they don't gaze at the moon, and so but humans do, and of course humans have lots of myths and stories and a lot of things to say about the moon, and there's a sense when we look at the moon, a sense of wonder, a sense of astonishment. Which comes from this opening to the cosmos, and the open that Heidegger was going on about, I suppose. And I was reading recently a poem of Rilke, who was saying that it's at that point where you open your eyes to the stars or to the moon that you say, I feel I need no closer connection than that. It's that when you open your eyes to these astronomically most distant objects, that you actually feel closest, most immersed in the cosmos of which you're a part. And so there's this fascinating way in which infinite distance and infinite proximity merge, become the same thing. And that, I think, is something to do with wonder. And I don't know the answer to this, but it would be a good question to ask as to whether non-human beings can be astonished, whether they wonder about what they observe, see, hear, feel. And maybe they do. And maybe they're more astonished by the world than we think. That was one thing. The other thing about between, it seems from what you said about trajection, that you're moving the question of betweenness to a kind of meta level, so that, you know, I was distinguishing two senses of between, like between this and that, and the in-between of the river's flow. I think what you're saying is that trajection goes on between these two. It's between the between of one sense and the in-between of the other. It's something, it's what's going on between what we say between A and B, and what we say just going along, there's something in between those two. And maybe that's where trajection is. It's in between the two betweens. I may be getting a bit lost there.
Okay, well, and also, I'd better, if there are other questions from other, the audience, are there questions?
There is a question, a written question. You can I can read it, but you can read it by yourself. But we have still some time, so I prefer if you if you can exchange together more, or perhaps have two suggestions. If you want to pursue, let's move, and I will add 2 or 3 global questions for both of you.
Of course, there are many questions which have been raised by Professor, by my commentator. That's,
yes, please.
One of the problems you have evoked is what relations can we find between trajection and translation. I think it is fundamentally the same problem. And when you translate or traject, I should perhaps explain where the word trajection comes from. In Renaissance French, it existed, a verb, trajecter existed. And for example, Montaigne uses it. When the Jews were expelled from Spain, the King of Portugal offered to traject them to Africa. So he used the word traject. There's the transport.
Like throw across, because that's what it means literally, doesn't it? Yeah, thrown across from Europe to Africa.
Yes, but there is, well, in that case, it's going from somewhere to elsewhere. But in the case, in the concept of trajection means, in my mind, that going to and fro from the subject to the object and return. And the verb, I have to translate it into Japanese. I have chosen the verb kayo, which means going to and fro. So it's and
that's fascinating, and I agree. It struck me as I was thinking about your paper that the trajection, or as you say, the problem of trajection and the problem of translation, they're really the same problem. And this is a fascinating thought, because then you start thinking again about what really happens in translation, and it's not simply a sort of decoding or just to say, oh, this means that and this means that. It involves much more than that, as we know. Something like a conversation, I think, in which each voice, let us say in French or Japanese, is responding to the other, and it's going back and forth. But it's going back and forth in time. It's not like interaction just literally going back and forth like in table tennis, ping pong. It's more like, I think, a musical fugue in which lines of counterpoint are continually answering to one another as they go along together. And that might be relevant because, of course, Vernacular used precisely that musical metaphor to talk about the way in which the lives of different species, like the spider and the fly, carry along together. So the word that I've wanted to use from English, and not referring necessarily to Baudelaire, is correspondence. Correspondence meaning lives going along together and answering to one another as they go. And it seemed to me that that translation is actually a form of correspondence in that sense, and so would be trajection in the sense that you want us to take it. So it's not simply a projection from A to B or connecting one thing up to another with a rope. It's something where that connection is going along and continually moving and evolving as it does so. Would I be right in that?
In projection, there is a transformation. So at that transformation, it applies also to the problem of evolution, which you have evoked to. And living beings, in the very process of taking the object as something, the environment as their milieu, they transform themselves. They are not only in that is the mesological thesis. It's not the law, the Darwin, the actual.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The environment is transformed by the life or through the life of the living being, and which in return is transformed.
Absolutely, and that's an ontogenetic process. It's carrying along, and it's carrying along over generations as well, which I agree, and this is actually a very fundamental challenge to Darwinian theory, which always insists on putting life inside generations and inheritance across them. Anyway, that's another debate, but it's important.
Yes.
And this idea is present in Imanishi's theory of evolution when he says, and he wrote from the beginning of his works, that living beings, between the subject and the environment, there is the subject is environmentalized by, and it subjectivates the environment. So this is really a trajective process.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. It's why I get so annoyed with evolutionary biologists who because people like, well, Imanishi, obviously, in the whole Japanese tradition, but also people like Vernacular and even Gibson, these were not part of the mainstream tradition of Western evolutionary biology. So that the lineage of thinking simply disappeared. And now we have evolutionary biologists suddenly saying, we have a brand new approach. Organisms actually are created and created by their environment. So this is a major advance. If they had bothered to listen to what other people have been saying years ago, they wouldn't have had to rediscover it. It makes me quite annoyed.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I agree so much. Please, Daniel, if you want to ask your question or comment, please.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Yes. Well, thank you very much for these for your discussion so far. It's been really fascinating, and also I think in some ways very challenging, really. But I would like to return to the moon and to the stars, because and to the sense of wonder, Tim, that you had mentioned, because that seems actually an important part of the discussion. The wonder, it seems to me, of the moon is not that the moon is there or that the stars are there, but that we are here together with it. And in fact, that there is a relationship between us, that we are partaking in something together. It's a question of a kind of open, it suggests to us a kind of open unity between our own subjective experience and the existence of the cosmos. And that seems a very challenging, on the one hand, real and at the same time very real feeling and sentiment and observation, and at the same time something that is very challenging to the science, the formalized forms of knowledge which we use to describe that reality and our reality as well. And so, Augustin, you have a fantastic line in your paper. You say, we must think off the beaten tracks, and we must use the art as our scout. And in fact, this is the reason I think that getting at this sensibility, this kind of open unity between self and everything else, is part of the reason why we have examined exactly this subject here, the question of the arts. So Augustin, I wonder if you would say a little bit more directly about the arts and its role in our inquiries now. And at the same time, Tim, as you have just said again, there have been insights coming from philosophy and other fields about the nature of the relationships between, of the relationships of the earth. And yet, our science is just now coming to be able to confront the fact that the differences between organisms sometimes is sometimes not as discrete as we like to say. And so I wonder if you would say a few words about what these ideas bring to science today, to our scientific way of understanding the world, because it's the science which is really defining the problems of climate change, for example, the challenges of the Anthropocene, these very pragmatic affairs of the world that I feel we should have more than sensibility. We must somehow build knowledge frameworks, experience frameworks. I'm not sure exactly how to say it, but maybe you can do better than I. Thank you.
Well, you have in the paper that Heidegger thinks that science always develops or exploits a field which has already been opened by art or by poetry, Dichtung. And Dichtung is about the same as saying predicated, to predicate it metaphorically in some way. Fundamental, that is that process. But science cannot be satisfied with metaphors. So it analyzes the elements of the metaphor and makes them through experience, experimentation, make it clear, and tries to find clear, as Descartes said, clearly, clear elements. And indefinitely, we have to reconnect those elements which have been dissociated by science. Because dissociating elements, it produces an unlivable world, a non-human, not non-human, but inhuman world. And that's the problem we have more and more, because on the one hand, science progresses every day, but also at the same time, as we all know more or less, at the same time, just as Tim Ingold said before concerning evolution, they discover things which had been thought of in another way, non-scientific way, already had been thought of. For example, in the Japanese language, it is structured in a way which is really phenomenological, in that it supposes the existence of a third term which interprets the object as something. An example which I like to use is that in French or in English, you can say, Mary is sad. Mary is so. But in fact, in Japanese, you can't say that. You have to say, Mary looks sad, because you are not Mary, so you cannot. You don't know what's inside Mary. So structurally, it's in that way. In that way, it supposes three terms: a subject, Mary, sadness, a second term, but in between, a third term, which is a living being, a human being. And this ternarity, you have it also in the Christian religion, when the existence of God manifests itself as a human through Mary, the woman who gives birth to the Christ. And this is God. This is Trinity. We call this Trinity because it's Holy Trinity. But here I'm talking of ternarity. There are three terms. And those three terms, as I said just before about the Japanese language, is very existential, very phenomenological. And the fact is, at the the utmost point of science, which nowadays we can say that is quantic philosophy, or the philosopher of quantics, they're talking about ternarity. I forgot his name on the moment, but an Italian physicist says that in order that two particles manifest themselves, they manifest themselves in relation with a third one. So I can't explain that, but that's only the idea of ternarity, which is important. And that idea of ternarity is traditionally expressed in Far Eastern cosmology, which is Chinese, fundamental to Chinese. That is, you have Do, or Ti, the earth, you have the sky, and in between you have an interpreter, which is the human, in that cosmology. So that's also the idea of ternarity. I'm not saying that it's the same, no, because historically it has been developed in different ways, etc. But the fundamental structure is ternary.
Tim, you want to pursue on art?
Yes. So, but your question was about art and science, and starting with the moon and the stars and the sense of wonder, and I suppose that this sense of wonder, which we know we have as human beings, we don't know so much about animals, is really what art is about. That art is perhaps a manifestation or realization of that sense of wonder. And the question is, it's not, do we want art or science? The question is about how we understand the relation between the two. And I think it would be right to say that for mainstream science, they would say that science is the fundamental thing. It gives us a privileged access to the reality of the world. What we're calling art is a space for the free play of the imagination, where imagination can roam. It's a bit vague, it's a bit subjective, it doesn't really count, might give us some good ideas which we could then test. But that science comes first, basically, and art is a luxury addition for civilized folk. I think maybe that would be a fairly widespread view. And along with that, the idea that wonder is intrinsically undisciplined, unfocused, vague, incapable of finding anything out or of revealing anything. It's just a look of blank astonishment. Wow. And when really what we're saying is that wonder is investigative, it is precise, it is revelatory, and we can, it's a way of actually paying attention and listening to the world. It's a point where wonder takes over is the point where we're not just observing the world, but where the world is teaching us how to observe. And it's where observation goes beyond facts. And it seems to me that, I mean, our objection to science perhaps is really an objection to the hypothetico-deductive method. And maybe not all science does that. So, but that's really the problem. I think what we should be doing is to reverse the relationship between science and art, to try and show how we can build a better science by recognizing that it is actually founded in that very sense of wonder. And the person I go back to is Goethe. I mean, Goethe, who was both an artist, a poet, and a scientist, a great student of botany. And he said, if you want to study plants, you have to spend time with them. You have to go and be by your plant and watch it over days and days and days, so that after a while, you begin to think like a plant. You begin to see like a plant, feel what the world feels like if you were a plant. And from there, you will grow into a proper understanding of plant morphogenesis, about how the plant grows, which is what Goethe was interested in. So he is practicing what in anthropology we would call participant observation with the plant, and saying that actually scientific knowledge builds on that, grows out of that sense. And it's very precise. It's not vague. It's not wishy-washy. It's not just, oh, it's precise observation. But just look at the way in which so-called Goethean science is treated by modern science today. It's regarded as completely ridiculous, completely disqualified by the idea that the observer should be caught up as a living being with that which they observe. Because the first rule of the hypothetical deductive method is that there should be no contact, no sensory involvement of the observer with that which captures their attention. And all of methodology has been devised as a means of immunizing the researcher from any affective contact with that which they observe. So my feeling is not that we should sort of choose art rather than science. It's that we should rebuild science on a much more modest and humble foundation, less totalitarian, that our knowledge of the world is grounded in our existence in it, and is no less rich and subtle for that. And just one last thing is that about metaphor, I put it this way, that with science and actually academic research in general, the idea is to take literal truths metaphorically. We use metaphors to talk about the literal truth of the world. It seems to me that the way of art is to take metaphorical truths literally, to actually take metaphor seriously as an avenue into truth. And that is the way of art, of myth, of storytelling. But it could also be the way of science, if only we did science differently. So I'm not against science, but I am against the kind of totalitarian science, big science, mega science, of the kind that is actually driving a lot of the climate change literature at the moment, which undercuts that sense that we can actually know the truth better by recognizing that it goes beyond the facts.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I may add a comment.
Shortly.
Shortly, yes, in a few words. I think that fundamentally art is a way of interpreting things, a way of interpreting reality. So it is essentially of predicative nature and qualitative nature, whereas science is mainly, it is searching not for P, but for S itself, in itself, an sich. And in that way, it becomes essentially quantitative, essentially. But reality is both, necessarily, because quantity only is nothing. Quality only is nothing. There is quantity and there is quality, and we need both. So.
Thank you for this comment, and effectively we are just pursuing the reflection on in terms of quality, in terms of quantity, but on art. In a way, we present this program and this day. We have also in mind the idea of vernacular art. So, and all what the anthropology of art, let's say like that, brings to us, it's in fact a way to revitalize the Occidental, or I will say the academic or elite vision of art. So I would like to have your mind also more precisely of the link we can make between artisans, craft people, art in terms of elite production and comment, and our topic on how to deal with Anthropocene question and living on Earth and producing. That's if you can add this third term to your debate, I will be pleased. But we have only 4 minutes now until the end. Sorry. Tim, well, your experience from Laponia, Augustin from Japan.
Augustin, you start?
No, you start.
Oh, I was going back in my mind to the very starting point of your paper, namely that art comes from ars, and the fundamental root, AR, is to join. And that it's really all of what we call art is about what it means to join things, how things can be joined, because only because things are joined in some ways can the world we inhabit be coherent, can hold together somehow. And I think all of these questions are questions about different kinds of joinings. And you asked about the Anthropocene. It's a word I don't like very much. And what I think I would like to just to conclude with one simple thing, and that is that we are rather conditioned in Western society to think of everything in terms of layers, stratigraphically, to form a stack. And I found it very helpful to use another metaphor for joining, not as layering, but as twining together, as in a rope, where a rope is wound from many different strands, but it holds together because of the way those strands bind around one another in different, one is with different twists. And it's in the tension and friction of things going along together that the coherence of the world lies. And that means maybe we should stop thinking, for example, of generations as following one another as layers in a stack, and think of them as going along together like the entwined fibers of a rope. And I think that metaphor comes to me from Laponie, from my fieldwork in Lapland.
Thank you. Augustin?
Well, to express my way of thinking with only 2 words. You know that in the European history, the difference between artisan and artist appeared with modernity. And that means that it appears with a dualistic way of thinking, etc. Whereas in Japan, the difference between artisan and artist is not clear at all. And you have so many artisanal products which are really artistic. So that's because, as I said before, the Japanese and mainly among the Japanese culture, mainly language itself, is prone to ternarity, not to duality. So I think that's a question we may talk about in the coming days.
Okay, so thank you, all of you. We should leave soon the panel, and so tomorrow I just announced. So I want to thank you very much, both of you, for your debate. Very challenging for all of us. And tomorrow we will explore perhaps a new word, the waza. And the Japanese word waza, and related to the art of garden and the techno-diversity of life, and how we manage this the microcosm of a garden and the microcosm of a garden. So in that way, we will have an interesting future debate for tomorrow, partly based on what you raised today. So let's meet tomorrow, and thank you all of participants and my colleagues Abe and Daniel to have followed in detail. Thank you all of you, and see you tomorrow. Bye bye.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.